In the early months of 1940, Europe was still trying to guess what Germany's next move would be. While France entrenched itself and the United Kingdom guarded its coasts, something seemingly unnoticed was happening to the north. Tons of iron ore were leaving Swedish mines every day, bound for North Sea ports. This raw material traveled through Norwegian territory, which remained officially neutral. But every shipment that crossed Narvik fueled German military production. In London and Paris, commanders debated whether to intervene. In Berlin, decisions were already being made. Hitler wanted to secure that route before the British acted. Blocking it wasn't enough. He planned to take over the entire country. Within weeks, ships began to move, maps were marked, and an order was given that would change all of Northern Europe. Without anyone declaring war, a large-scale operation was underway. How was it possible to occupy Norway so quickly, with so many open fronts without anyone seeing it coming? The iron that crossed the sea. It was the middle of winter in 1940, and the north seemed quiet, but every day heavy cargoes left Narvik for Germany. It wasn't just any cargo, it was minerals mined in Sweden and shipped via Norway, a country that, at least on paper, remained uninvolved in the conflict. When the Baltic Sea was blocked by ice, this northern port free of ice became key. Ships loaded with the resource that kept the Nazi regime's war industry running departed from there. Trains from Kiruna and Gällivare never stopped. Norwegian neutrality protected the entire route. If that chain was broken, Berlin could no longer manufacture tanks or weapons. London already had that in mind, so did Paris. The idea was to cut off the route without having to attack directly, but moving into foreign territory without a solid justification could have diplomatic consequences. Meanwhile, in Berlin, there was no doubt. Action had to be taken now. Information about enemy naval activity in the region increased every week. Reports were reaching the German command warning of patrols near Scandinavian ports. Some agents spoke of possible British movements in key cities. The situation could not continue like this. That's when Quizling appeared. A former Norwegian minister with ambitions of his own and ties to the Germans, he offered an unexpected way out. He said he could facilitate an internal power shift and allow free passage of troops to take control of the coast. The commanders in Berlin listened attentively. Raeder, the head of the navy, was quick to present this option to Hitler. Up until that point, the plan had been to stay out of Norway, but this proposal changed everything. Hitler wasn't taking any risks. He ordered a comprehensive operation designed. He wanted to take over the entire country without exception. From the capital to the far north, every port, every airfield, and every railway line was to be placed under German control. A month later, the idea was approved. Few knew what was being prepared. Even within the army, many were unaware of the magnitude of the plan. They gave it the code name, Weserübung. The excuse was a precautionary measure, but the objective was clear. Everything had to be done quickly. Transport would be by sea in a complicated environment. Without naval control in the area, the operation required constant air support and specialized troops who could fight in extreme conditions with cold, ice, and difficult geography. Meanwhile, Churchill was pushing in the opposite direction. He wanted to cut off the iron ore passage before the Germans secured it. He proposed laying mines in the nearby sea to force the ships to change course. This way, they could be intercepted in more convenient areas. But back home, they were hesitant. No one wanted to be the one to initiate an attack against a state that had not yet taken part in the war. In any case, London was already moving forward. They were studying possible landing sites. Narvik was the main one, but not the only one. They had everything on the table, waiting for Germany to take the first step. But indecision was working against them. The discussions weren't resolved. France didn't want to commit without guarantees. That left things half done. In Germany, the opposite was true. They wasted no time. Hitler chose Falkenhorst to be in charge of the plan. He demanded immediate results. Without maps or files, the general improvised with what he found. He bought a guidebook and, from a hotel room, mapped out the essentials. He chose strategic cities. He wanted them all to fall at the same time: Oslo, Bergen, Trondheim, Narvik. If that were achieved, the entire country would be paralyzed. The key was to move before the British did anything. And the top priority was Narvik, because not only did the iron ore come from there, but it was the only port in that area that remained operational during the winter. Swedish trains arrived directly at the dock. Controlling that point meant closing off the northern passage. In February, while the talks between the two governments continued in secret, the Germans were already preparing every detail. The target cities were ready, the ships were selected, the schedules were drawn up. All that was missing was the order. By March, there was already movement. Submarines were scanning routes, aircraft were photographing coastlines, informants on the ground were passing on information about enemy ship movements. Everything indicated it was a matter of days, and so it was. In April, the green light was given. The ships headed north, each one with a predetermined destination. Warships, camouflaged freighters, submarines, destroyers, all headed for key points. The move was risky. Germany didn't dominate the seas. If the enemy responded quickly, the plan could fall apart. But they were banking on surprise, and speed was part of the plan. Before dawn on April 9th, they were already entering Norwegian waters. Soon, the landings began. Soldiers in small boats, planes taking to the airstrips, officers securing state buildings. Each action occurred in different cities at the same time. The objective was to leave no room for reaction. And in the midst of all this, Narvik became the most critical focus of the entire offensive. A plan in 24 hours. When the decision was made to invade Norway, there were no maps ready and no troops organized. Hitler gave the order without waiting for anyone. He called in a general with no naval experience, no equipment of his own, and no idea what he was doing. Nikolaus von Falkenhorst was tasked with designing everything from scratch. He had to prepare the entire entry into a long, frozen country full of mountains and with impossible coastlines, and all of this had to be done in just one day. They told him the basics and let him do it. He had to coordinate air attacks, paratrooper jumps, sea movements and land advances without prior planning or special resources. He returned to the hotel, locked himself in and opened a guidebook. No secret documents, just that little book to put together the operation. He began pointing out key locations. Oslo had to fall first. Central Command was controlled from there. Bergen was important because of the port. Trondheim offered a useful airbase. Kristiansand and Stavanger opened access from the south. Narvik, at the far end, guaranteed the passage of Swedish iron ore. They made it clear that everything had to happen at the same time. Only in this way could they avoid an organized reaction. If anything was delayed, the British would be fully involved. There was no room for error. Falkenhorst divided the forces into 6 teams, each with a city as their objective. They were to enter, take key points, and avoid destruction. No confrontation was sought. It was occupation, not destruction. Meanwhile, at the High Command, they were searching for ships wherever they could. Freighters, ferries, destroyers, light cruisers. Anything that could sail was fine. It had to look like any other operation. To throw them off the scent, the ships' routes would be different. No convoys. They would depart separately with alternating schedules but arriving at the same time. Some would carry infantry, others mountain soldiers, others paratroopers. In parallel, the German Air Force organized short flights to monitor Norwegian airfields as soon as everything began. Those who jumped from the air had very specific tasks. They had to cut communications, seize airfields and block routes. To prepare, they used photos from the sky and hand-drawn maps. They rehearsed night flights with few references. Each pilot had to know exactly where to land without ever having been there. The problem wasn't just getting in, they had to justify it. Berlin prepared a speech. They said they were only seeking to protect the country's neutrality against an English invasion. They would print papers to distribute to the people. The text was crafted to sound gentle without strong words, just what was necessary to stop a chain reaction. The next day, Falkenhorst showed the outline. The plan was simple, direct, and unadorned. Hitler made no comments. He approved everything immediately. The final steps were activated. The ships began loading weapons, vehicles, fuel, and food. Radios were packed, maps were loaded, and weapons were distributed among compartments. The soldiers didn't know where they were going. They only received instructions inside the ship. Each one received a sealed envelope that wasn't opened until they were at sea. No one knew the name of the mission. They only knew they had to disembark quickly and take up positions without asking questions. The schedules were precise. If one arrived ahead of schedule, they risked being exposed. If someone was late, it would ruin the rest. The northern climate was an additional problem. They had to be constantly recalculating. As the ships moved forward, intelligence agents inside Norway passed on information. They used local contacts to know where the patrols were, which roads were clear, and which bases were active. Every day they sent these coded reports back to Berlin, and every night the plan was adjusted accordingly. Other groups were on the move as well. Disguised as ordinary passengers, they crossed borders by train. When the time came, they were to act from within. In the ports, communications equipment was prepared. Those radios would be the only useful items when the main lines were cut. The final date was set in early April. The 9th was the chosen moment. The weather, enemy naval movement, and available natural light were assessed. Everything fit. The night before, on the 8th, the vessels departed. Some from Bremen, others from Stettin, Wilhelmshaven, or Kiel. They left separately, but at the same time. 40 ships headed north, each with its assigned destination. The submarines were already en route. Their mission was to ensure that the Royal Navy didn't appear in the middle of the operation. The planes took off just after midnight. They were headed directly for the Norwegian airports. Everything moved noiselessly. On land, no one suspected. Norway remained calm. They relied on diplomatic agreements. Their soldiers were in bases, unprepared for what was coming. In Oslo, the government slept peacefully. No one imagined that in a few hours everything would change. From his control post, Falkenhorst read coded reports. Everything was going well. No ships had been seen. The weather remained stable. Everything was progressing as planned. The operation was silent and precise. The only thing that could bring it down was a swift reaction from London, but no one there was making a decision. They continued to doubt. They didn't believe Hitler would be capable of opening another front in the north while he had everything underway in Western Europe. It was a mistake. At 5 o'clock, the landings began. The first boats touched down. 20 or 30 minutes later, several towns were under control. The troops knew what to do. Each unit had clear instructions. They took key buildings, secured ports, and advanced without interruption. The pace surprised even the commanders themselves. From headquarters, Falkenhorst received updates every few minutes. Bergen was secured. So was Trondheim. Stavanger was in German hands. No area had gone off schedule. What had been assembled with a guidebook and without official maps in just one day worked flawlessly. The plan that seemed impossible was being fulfilled step by step. Denmark fell in 4 hours. As the German ships headed toward Norway, another operation was activated to the south. Denmark, which had long avoided involvement, became a direct target. It wasn't a major power, nor did it have key weapons, but its location offered something Germany wasn't willing to give up: direct passage to the Baltic and quick access to Scandinavia. The order came bluntly. They couldn't allow the British to gain a foothold there. If they occupied Danish territory, the entire eastern flank of the plan would be exposed. So, although Norway was the primary objective, Denmark was the obligatory stop to avoid problems later on. The message was brief: enter the entire country in a single movement, without dividing forces, without waiting for resistance. The time frame had to be so small that the local authorities couldn't even react. On paper, they called it a preemptive action, but it was a lightning maneuver calculated to the last detail. Hours before dawn, German vehicles crossed the borderline. Light tanks, motorcycles, armored vehicles, and squads advanced along predetermined paths. No one reported anything. There were no warnings. By the time local radio began broadcasting what was happening, the Germans were already taking the southern cities. Meanwhile, paratroopers descended on defined points. The capital was one of the first targets. Units reached the port, blocked stations, and surrounded government buildings without using ammunition. Within half an hour, everything relevant was under control. Above, fighter jets patrolled the skies. They weren't coming to attack. Their role was to deter. The message was clear: don't try anything. The outnumbered local air force didn't even take off. On the ground, the few available troops were neutralized without confrontation. Communication lines went down in minutes. The army wasn't ready for that kind of operation. They had few people, poor equipment, and no modern training. The plan to stay out of the way fell apart as soon as they crossed the first vehicle heading toward the capital. The Danish cabinet received the first warnings and met immediately. There weren't many options. They knew that attempting anything would only result in civilian deaths. Accepting what was coming was the most practical course of action. The king decided to stay in the country. He didn't seek refuge or ask anyone for help. He only demanded that official structures be respected. German troops were already positioned at key points. No looting, attacks on the population, or punishments were reported. They wanted to secure logistical access. They posted guards on bridges, stations, and offices. Neighborhood surveillance was maintained, but without intervention. In just 4 hours, the entire Danish map was under control. From the south to the ports, the occupation was completed without major clashes. The only pockets of resistance were isolated, uncoordinated, and quickly extinguished. People watched from their homes as flags were changed, military offices were opened, and transportation routes were altered without gunfire or clashes. One of the first locations secured was Bornholm, in the middle of the Baltic Sea. The position there was key for monitoring shipping routes between Sweden, Germany, and the Soviet zone. The assigned units arrived and took control within minutes. There were no bombings, no one heard sirens. The streets showed no damage. It was a swift invasion, silent but effective. Everything happened so fast that even neighboring countries couldn't process it in time. In London, the news came as a shock. Churchill and his team understood that this wasn't an isolated move. It was a connected plan to seal the north from the coast to the eastern border. The German presence in Denmark also functioned as an airlift. From there, flights began to take off for Norway with reinforcements, supplies, and weapons. The Danish bases, previously inactive, became indispensable logistics centers to support what was coming north. Meanwhile, the Danish authorities sought to continue functioning. Unlike in other occupied areas, they were allowed to maintain part of the government. Parliament continued to function. The king was not removed. The civil structure remained in place, albeit under external supervision. This model would continue for the first few years. The majority of the population accepted what happened with resignation. There were no major protests or riots in the first few days. Pockets of resistance emerged later when the foreign presence began to be felt more harshly. From Berlin, the result was hailed as a complete achievement. Having taken over an entire country without causing significant damage or direct casualties, and doing so in less than a morning, was interpreted as a demonstration of absolute efficiency. Such actions would be used as an example for future operations. For those who participated, the mission was marked as one of the cleanest they had ever executed. They returned to their ranks without firing a shot. Many received decorations. The operation was later used in military schools to demonstrate how to carry out an occupation without formal resistance. From a territorial perspective, having Denmark in their hands allowed them to close off northern access to the Baltic. Any movement in that area was under scrutiny. Submarines, commercial ships, enemy convoys. Nothing was left unchecked. Furthermore, it ensured a useful base in case plans in Norway went awry. If anything went wrong, they could use Denmark as a backup to regroup or escape by sea. It wasn't just another country on the map, it was a liaison point between the command center and the Arctic. That's how the morning ended. While there was nothing left to move in the south, operations in Norway were just beginning. Everything north was still in progress. Across the strait, the war was just getting started. The fjord swallowed the Blücher. Shortly before dawn, a group of German ships advanced through the fjord leading to Oslo. The heavy cruiser Blücher led the way. Their task was straightforward: reach the center of the capital, land troops, seize key buildings, and trap the government before anyone could escape. They had lists of objectives, detailed maps, and a precise order: occupy without engaging. The German commanders thought the passage was clear. They believed the Norwegian guns were old, the defenses were minimal, and the element of surprise was enough. That's why the Blücher moved forward with its lights off at low speed, crossing the water without a care in the world. They didn't know that, hidden in the middle of that passage, an old base was still active. Oscarsborg, built on an island in the fjord, still had serviceable weapons. It even stored torpedoes controlled from an underground room. The soldiers at that base knew something was wrong. They had already received vague warnings, and when they saw the unidentified ships approaching, they decided to fire. At 4:20, the first shells were fired. 2 hit the Blücher directly. 1 pierced the topsides. The other exploded near the ammunition storage area. The flames soon spread. Inside, the fire spread through the corridors while the crew tried to understand what was happening. The shots didn't stop. Every minute, another one arrived. The ship tried to turn to get out of range, but it was too large and slow. Before it could maneuver, it was already experiencing internal explosions. The heat was unbearable. Smoke billowed from the openings and internal signals began to fail. From the underground station, the Norwegians launched the torpedoes. 2 slashes hit the side of the ship. One hit where the fuel was stored, the other hit a technical section. The water surged, the structure was splitting, the power went out, the turbines shut down. No one heard any alarms, only the fire, the screams, and the panic remained. Some officers tried to organize an escape route, but many jumped into the water without life jackets. Others were trapped in enclosed areas. The doors had sealed shut. The ship began to turn. It listed to one side. Water rushed in. The flames continued. The ammunition exploded due to the temperature. Internal explosions hastened the sinking. At 7 a.m., the Blücher disappeared underwater. It remained a short distance from the shore. There were more than 2,000 people on board. Hundreds died instantly. Many others were injured. Those who managed to swim ashore were arrested by local police and armed residents. The sinking wasn't just a tactical loss. It changed the entire day. That ship was carrying key personnel for controlling Oslo, regime officials, translators, agents, and documents. All of that was lost beneath the fjord. The ships following behind didn't know how to react. They saw the flames and slowed down. Some tried to turn back. Others waited for further instructions. The passage was blocked. That pause gave the Norwegian government the opportunity it needed. In the capital, the authorities were alerted. They informed King Haakon that the enemy advance had failed. They began evacuating official equipment. They prepared for the monarch's departure. They also sent a radio message explaining what was happening. This time, allowed the government to escape. They left in cars for the interior. They didn't have heavy escorts, nor did they know if there were any safe routes. But the Germans still didn't control the area. It was a quick exit, just before the roads were closed. In Oslo, people didn't quite understand what was happening. Some thought it was an accident. Others heard the shots and went out into the street. A few German soldiers were already inside, but they weren't enough to secure the city. They advanced, unaware that the king had already left. The loss of the Blücher was also a symbolic blow. It was a new, large ship with modern weapons and the capacity to transport soldiers. Its destruction by an old base left those who organized the plan in a bad light. In Berlin, the news went down badly. The attack had to be swift. But now, with some of the units blocked and the government out of reach, the timetable was no longer valid. Hitler demanded an explanation. Raeder tried to downplay it. He said the operation was continuing, but it was too late. The mistake had been made. The scene in the fjord was chaotic. Pieces of the ship, fuel slicks, and bodies floated about. Some of the wounded were taken to makeshift medical centers. Others were treated by ordinary people, unaware that they were actually part of the operation. The defenders celebrated what had happened. Oscarsborg became a symbol. Its commander Birger Eriksson was seen as an example. He had no direct orders. He fired of his own volition. That moment changed the entire day. The sea passage was closed for several hours. The ships following behind sought routes elsewhere, but there was no way to take Oslo as planned. The element of surprise was lost. The German forces had to split up, advance overland, and accept that the original plan had failed. Thus began the operation in southern Norway with a shipwreck, with fire on the water and trapped soldiers. The attempt at a rapid entry ended in chaos, with the king out of the city and the ship at the bottom of the fjord. The day Norway woke up bombed. It was early morning and Norway was still asleep. The radios broadcast the same as always. The streets were empty. The headlights rotated like any other night. But all that changed without warning. In several cities at the same time, ships no one expected began to appear. Planes crossed the sky at low altitude. No one knew what was happening. In the capital, the Blücher had already sunk, but the soldiers behind them were entering by land. Although they had lost time, the troops continued forward. In the streets, people stared in surprise at the German uniforms. There was no official announcement. No one had said they were at war. Only soldiers could be seen occupying public buildings. In Bergen, the port was the first target. The ships crossed without resistance. All around, paratroopers began to land. No one could stop them. The local commanders were trapped within minutes. The main headquarters was in German hands before anyone could organize a defense. By 6 o'clock, the city was already taken. In Trondheim, the operation was more complicated. Several groups landed at the same time. Some Norwegians tried to halt the advance with light weapons, but they didn't last long. The invaders split into sections and seized key locations without delay. The main station, the power center, the town hall. Everything fell within a few hours. Stavanger took the first hit from the air. While it was still dark, they bombed the airport runway. Then more planes landed with reinforcements. On the ground, there was some shooting, but chaos quickly took over. Officers didn't know who was attacking or why. In Kristiansand, everything was coordinated. The ships entered with dim lights. The first group disembarked without problem. The next went directly to cut communications. Within minutes, the city was cut off. By 8 o'clock, it was under German control. In Egersund, the objective was different. They took the international wiring station. There was no resistance. The personnel were arrested without violence. The German flag was raised without opposition. Narvik was the most intense. With snow everywhere, 10 destroyers arrived at 5 in the morning. Each one carried men ready to disembark. The response was slow. The defensive guns were unable to stop the attack. Before noon, they had the entire city under control. In less than a day, 7 key cities had been occupied. Everything happened in parallel. Norway had no unified leadership. Telephone lines were down. No one knew who was in charge. Some were ordered to wait. Others attempted blockades that didn't last long. At many points, soldiers entered without firing. They said they were coming to protect neutrality. They carried papers explaining that the British were planning to invade. They used this to confuse the situation. Some civilians thought it was a pre-arranged intervention. Others instantly understood that it was a real invasion. Columns of trucks were also visible in the countryside. On certain roads, the military advanced on foot. It wasn't a limited attack, it was a full deployment, air, sea, land, and all at the same time. The radio stations began to cut off their programming. Some spoke from what they saw out the window. Others repeated messages without knowing if they were official. In Oslo, before closing the signal, the authorities warned that the government was moving. Access roads were secured, bridges controlled, train stations guarded, airports occupied. Every entrance and exit was in German hands. Even the smallest towns had a military presence. They weren't just targeting the capitals. They sought to blockade the entire country. In rural areas, people gathered outside police offices. They wanted answers. No one had them. Some local leaders said they were waiting for news. Others didn't know what to say. The only clear answer was confusion. News didn't come through official channels, only rumors. At sea, Norwegian ships tried to escape. Some were attacked, others surrendered. The fleet had no way to cover the entire coastline. Many captains chose to leave the country and seek safety. Everything was improvised. The German Air Force flew non-stop. They didn't attack en masse, but they hit where it mattered. Runways, depots, railway lines. Every move sought to cut off any attempt at reaction. During the day, the flags changed. New symbols began to appear on buildings. Schools closed, banks suspended operations. The mail stopped working. Routines disappeared. Soldiers settled into whatever they found. Some occupied empty schools, others stayed in stations. Not all were welcomed without rejection. In several towns, groups of armed residents appeared. They weren't from the army, just residents trying to defend something. The clashes were minor that day, but the tension was evident. No one knew how long it would last. Some hoped the British would react. Others thought it was a pre-arranged plan and that they would leave soon. The only real truth was that the country was already occupied. That was the case that day. A foreign power took position at every key point, not with a single offensive, but with movements designed to close off all exits. With snow in the north, wind in the south, and having done nothing to provoke it, Norway woke up under siege without having had a chance to prepare. Narvik, the coldest battles of the Reich. As the soldiers advanced south, a line of German destroyers slid through the snow toward Narvik. Each ship carried mountain-trained troops, but nothing had prepared them for this climate. The wind froze their skin, the paths disappeared beneath the ice, and the horizon was almost indistinguishable. The landing was swift. No one was expecting them. The Norwegian ships were at a standstill with no active defenses. Within minutes, the Germans descended and occupied the central area. Commander Dietl set up his base near the train. From there, he deployed squadrons throughout the surrounding area. Narvik was connected to the Swedish mines. The mineral that supplied Germany came from there. Losing that port was not an option. It also served as a military outpost in the north. But there was a problem. They had no way out. Dietl and his men were trapped between mountains and icy water. A few hours later, a British naval force entered the fjord. Under Warburton Lee's command, 5 enemy destroyers opened fire, gunfire, torpedoes, thick smoke. In less than 60 minutes, 5 German ships were destroyed, some exploded, others sank. The few that remained sought refuge among the ice. The blow was direct. Dietl lost more than half of the naval support without a chance to react. Many soldiers didn't even disembark in time. Some managed to swim, covered in oil, others disappeared. There were no more bullets or vehicles. Narvik remained in German hands, but in critical condition. The British didn't stay. They didn't bring troops to hold the position. They damaged what they could and left. The plan was to weaken the area. Days later, new Allied groups arrived, this time with Polish and French units. They wanted to recapture the port at any cost. The offensive began from different points. They advanced through deep snow, fired from gaps and descended slopes with no visibility. The weather damaged their rifles, their boots became stiff, and their movements were slow. Their backpacks became soaked and heavier. Dietl didn't move. He organized everything with what little he had. He put men on the roofs, buried explosives between rocks, and placed snipers wherever he could. Every entrance had cover. The streets became funnels. The clashes were face-to-face, sometimes between 2 houses, other times on snow-covered corners. Each group defended itself without knowing what was happening beyond. Orders were shouted between explosions. Bullets ricocheted off wet rocks. The slopes were dangerous. The caves offered no safety. The rivers seemed frozen, but they broke under the weight. Some fell into the water and didn't return. Others were trapped between stiff branches. Food was a problem from the start. Dietl's soldiers ate whatever was left, old cans, stale bread, snow water. They lit fires every few minutes just to keep from freezing. The supplies dwindled day by day. The Allies had more resources, but the terrain prevented them from advancing. Ships couldn't get close. Planes crashed out of range. Some supplies ended up on the enemy side. Others were lost in frozen forests. No one advanced. Dietl held on. Every area they lost, they recaptured in small groups. They descended at night in silence. They used knives, grenades, weaved through rocks, and crossed under blankets covered with branches. The Allied ranks began to break. The Poles continued fighting, but they couldn't hold their positions. The cold broke their weapons. Their hands bled. Their boots split open. Many fell ill. The doctors couldn't handle them all. In mid-May, the British entered part of the port. They advanced to the docks, but Dietl still held the town hall, the railway, and several depots. From there, they launched rapid attacks. They blocked routes with dynamite. They placed snipers in high towers. No one was safe. Suddenly, attention shifted. Germany was attacking the west, Belgium, Holland, France. London ordered the abandonment of Norway. The front no longer mattered. Allied officers began to retreat. There was no time to waste. During the retreat, they left behind what they had gained. They burned documents, destroyed radios, and boarded ships without looking back. Dietl, who thought all was lost, watched as the enemy withdrew. What had seemed like the end became permanent. Narvik was destroyed. Houses were split, ice everywhere, roofs collapsed. Bodies frozen among the remains of buildings. The radios no longer worked. The holds were empty. The port was still there, but motionless. Dietl's group survived the encirclement, the extreme climate, and a combined attack. They did so without assistance, with limited resources, and using only organization and physical endurance. It wasn't a huge battle, but it was one of the toughest due to the conditions. Those who lived through it never forgot Narvik. There, fighting was no longer a strategy. It was about holding on with what you had. Betrayal in uniform, Quizling takes command. While soldiers crossed fjords and occupied cities in Oslo, a politician was moving on his own. Vidkun Quisling, without any real support, moved from one office to another, seeking to seize power without being asked. He had been trying to position himself for some time. He had founded his own party, copied foreign symbols, and maintained contacts with German commanders. His name appeared frequently in intelligence reports. He was seen as ambitious, unreliable, but useful if a Norwegian face was needed. When news of the landings began to arrive, many officials left their posts. The government was leaving the capital. The king was gone. The lines were down. The state apparatus was out of control. This was the moment Quisling had been waiting for. On the morning of the 9th, he walked to the state radio studios. He had no escort. He was unarmed. He entered, spoke to the technicians, and asked to speak. He knew there was no official communication. Whatever came out on that signal would be taken as truth. From the microphone, he read a message. He introduced himself as the head of the new government. He stated that the foreign troops were acting in concert. He ordered the forces to cease all response. He assured them of stability. He didn't consult him. No one elected him. He just said it. Many didn't know who he was. Others thought he was speaking on behalf of the king. Some commanders, confused, stopped. In certain areas, that voice was taken as a valid order. The mere fact of using national radio raised doubts. The reaction varied depending on the region. In the south, some suspended operations. In the north, they ignored him completely. Active units didn't know whether they should respond. The chain of command was fractured. In Berlin, the announcement came as a surprise. No one had assigned him that role, but they didn't intervene. If it served to reduce the backlash, they let him speak. Officers would arrive later to control the situation. Quisling set up shop in a centrally located building. From there, he began signing papers, appointing officials, and issuing decrees. In reality, no one was following him. He had a desk and a radio, but what he said could be heard everywhere. Meanwhile, the country remained in a state of confusion. Some believed the cabinet had been replaced. Others thought it was a setup. The streets were empty. Businesses were closed. No one was clear about who was in charge. The legitimate government was still on its way. The king and his ministers rejected everything he'd said. They didn't recognize the appointment, but they couldn't respond. They had no access to the media. The German troops didn't officially appoint him, nor did they remove him. They left him because his presence caused confusion. While he spoke, the soldiers secured key locations without organized resistance. Shortly after, German envoys arrived. They met with him. They explained that he would only have a decorative role. He could continue making commercials, but they would be in control. He didn't argue. He agreed unconditionally. What he wanted was to continue appearing. The new bosses overhauled his environment. They changed names, added rules, imposed filters. From then on, Quisling was under control. He no longer said what he wanted. He only repeated what he was authorized to. The population, which at first understood nothing, soon saw him as a ridiculous figure. He had no authority. What he signed was not obeyed. The churches ignored him. In the markets, they didn't greet him. His name began to be used to label traitors. For the next few months, his image was used to simulate order. He gave speeches, appeared in photographs, visited places, but he had no real power. He was displayed to give a legal appearance. Meanwhile, important decisions were made elsewhere. The ministries were filled with German officials. Everything went through them: laws, the economy, education. The media were managed from outside. Schools changed their content. Public events were banned. Quisling never protested. He adapted to the new environment. He preferred to remain visible, even if he didn't decide anything. He wore official suits, signed documents, received delegations. Meanwhile, the country was changing from within. Some groups were beginning to organize. Small networks appeared in different cities. They hid messages, distributed papers, stockpiled weapons. They weren't acting yet, but they were preparing. Quisling's figure also served to unite those who opposed him. No one wanted to appear close to him. Even the most passive avoided using his name. Former officials, young people, farmers, everyone rejected him. As time passed, the atmosphere grew more tense. Controls increased, arrests multiplied. Searches were frequent, distrust grew. But the contempt for Quisling remained unchanged. On paper, he was still the boss. In practice, he didn't command anyone. He couldn't appoint officials. He had no control over his own security. He was only given messages to read. For the first year, he was a figurehead. Then, when the mass arrests began, his face became linked to what was happening. Even if he didn't sign every order, he appeared as support. What began as an attempt to seize power became a symbol of collaboration. His name became an insult. In other languages, his last name was used to point out those who betrayed him. What he sought as a personal achievement ended as collective contempt. It all began with a voice on the radio, a misplaced flag, and an unsupported ambition. The king flees and the English do not arrive. When the shooting in Oslo began, Haakon VII was no longer in the official building. Scattered reports had reached him during the night. They told him of soldiers entering through the fjord, of the sinking of an enemy ship, and of a broader attack in progress. Without waiting for confirmation, he got into a car with his son and a small group of companions. The capital had not yet been occupied. The streets were still empty. Many officials were fleeing aimlessly. There were no guides, protection, or coordination. All that remained was to escape inland, taking minor routes, avoiding any guarded passages. The order was to get away before they were surrounded. The convoy was assembled quickly. They used private cars. They packed little: clothes, blankets, a few handguns. They carried no emblems or royal robes. They were just older men dressed like ordinary people trying to move forward without attracting attention. The journey wasn't easy. The main routes were already patrolled. They chose rural paths, crossed wooden bridges, and descended slippery slopes. The weather changed hourly: drizzle, fog, grey skies. At times they couldn't see more than a few meters ahead. During the first stretch, no one stopped them. In some places, people were peering out of their houses. They didn't know who was in the vehicles. They didn't ask. Some offered coffee, others watched in silence. The atmosphere was more tense than curious. The objective was to find a place to reorganize. They looked for telegraph stations, but they were either closed or unmanned. They tried to talk to army groups. The few who responded had no directives. Each squadron acted on its own. That night they slept in a farmhouse. They used blankets and slept on the floor. The owners shared bread, soup, and a little firewood. No one asked names. Everyone knew something serious was happening. The next day they continued their journey. In the capital, the Germans were entering without haste. The sinking of the Blücher had slowed their advance. They didn't manage to reach the key buildings in time. When they entered the center, the place was empty. Berlin wanted to show an orderly takeover without confrontation. Capturing the king was part of the plan. Signing a surrender would make everything easier, but he was already gone. They weren't trying to kill him. They wanted him to give in. They offered money for information. They asked in villages, but no one responded. They protected him without speaking. The group continued moving. They changed cars several times. Some broke down, others got stuck in the mud. They used trains for short stretches. At each station, they got off quietly. They mingled with ordinary passengers. Several times, they passed close to enemy troops without being noticed. They had no visible bodyguards, just a priest, 2 assistants, the heir, and a few others. No one showed any signs of power. That appearance helped them continue without trouble. In a mountain village, they managed to contact a military unit that was still active. The officer offered vehicles, shelter, and men to guard them. From there, Håkon was able to send a general message. He didn't use war phrases. He didn't mention enemies. He only said that he would continue to fulfill his role wherever he went, that he didn't accept imposed structures, and that he didn't recognize governments without a legal basis. The communiqué was brief. That same day, enemy emissaries arrived for negotiations. They were ignored. Direct communication was requested from the German command. No deal that would overrule the constitution was accepted. The response was firm. It left no room for interpretation. Meanwhile, in London, discussions were underway about how to help. Churchill was pushing for intervention. But what was happening in France was complicating everything. There weren't enough resources. Landing troops took time, and planes were assigned to other fronts. Urgent assistance was promised, but days passed without any real sign. The few allies in Norway were far from the capital. They had no direct connection with the king or local groups. No one knew exactly where it was. From Sweden, some journalists tracked the convoy. They published general details. This put pressure on the invaders, but also alerted those who wanted to capture it. The risk increased. To avoid surprises, they split into 2. They took different routes. They communicated through written notes. In the villages, they stayed for a short time. They changed locations every night. They used short-range radios to share locations. The weather continued to be an obstacle. Food was scarce. They slept wherever they could, in warehouses, schools, parishes. They took turns staying awake at night. No one believed they were safe. On some stretches, they used bicycles. On others, they walked along unmarked paths. The king accepted no privileges. He walked at everyone's pace. He wore a heavy coat and carried a notebook. People were beginning to recognize him. In some villages, they received him with respect. In others, they hung white banners as a sign of support. They held no rallies. They just wanted to see him present. When the northern area was safer, they organized a permanent station. Officials arrived from different regions. Communications were reactivated. A small political nucleus was formed. Håkon continued to move, but he was no longer escaping. He was beginning to lead. They read reports, he signed documents, he appeared at meetings. He understood that as long as he remained free, the country would resist. In Oslo, the occupiers feigned normalcy. They raised flags, marched, read statements, but they didn't have the official leader. His absence left everything incomplete. They tried to offer positions to well-known figures. No one accepted. No one wanted to be associated with them. The rejection was strong. The king's departure became a symbol, not out of heroism but out of clarity. He wasn't captured, he didn't give in, he didn't disappear. Vertical combat, warfare in the mountains. While the ports were secured and the cities fell one by one, the inland mountains offered a different scenario. There were no avenues, no centers of power, no checkpoints. Only dense trees, icy slopes, impossible passes, ice everywhere. There, the fighting changed shape. The Allies who landed in the west were sent upwards. The plan was to cut off the advance from within. They wanted to recapture sections of the railway and secure areas far from the coast. But to do so, they had to climb hills, cross ravines, and hold out amidst the ice. The Norwegian soldiers knew these roads. They knew where to cross unseen, which passes were blocked by snow, where the ice broke. The French and British knew nothing. They moved slowly. They needed help. They often became disoriented. The Germans didn't have it easy either. Their vehicles didn't move on soft ground. The mules they used to carry ammunition skidded. Some fell into the void. The tents couldn't withstand the weather. Their shoes fell apart. The air was so dry their noses bled. Every clash in these areas had different rules. There were no clear fronts. They fought over hills, over huts, over forgotten crossings. Nothing stood. Positions changed constantly. Groups were accidentally separated. Some were left alone for days. The shooting was sporadic. It wasn't a mass attack. There were short bursts, ambushes, grenades thrown from rocks. Often the other side couldn't even be seen. All you could hear were footsteps in the snow, echoes and loose gunshots. The shooters had the advantage. They hid in high spots, covered with branches. They didn't move for hours. They waited to see a helmet. They fired once. Then they went down secondary routes using skis or ropes. As night fell, everything became more complicated. The fog lifted. The sounds mingled. The gunshots grew closer. The orders were shouted aimlessly. Some fired without looking. Others ran in the opposite direction. There wasn't enough food. Shipments arrived late or not at all. Many packages ended up where they weren't supposed to. Some fell into enemy territory. Rations were cut to the bare minimum. Some boiled bark with melted snow. Hunger caused many to begin to see things. Some fainted before reaching the front. Their clothes were useless. Their gloves tore. Their coats became soaked. Their weapons didn't respond. Their sights fogged up. Their magazines didn't lock properly. Many fired without seeing. Sometimes a bayonet was more useful than a rifle. The wounds weren't from combat. They were from frostbite, blows, falls, exhaustion. Some couldn't continue. They were left in empty houses with a blanket, a flashlight, and a piece of bread. Going back for them was impossible. The radios didn't work well. They cut out. Orders didn't get through. Messengers took hours to get there and back. Sometimes they shot their own men by mistake. Even so, the Norwegians continued. They slid down the valleys on skis. They left explosives under branches. They attacked quickly and left. At night, they ate with peasants, repaired their weapons, and returned to the mountains. The British tried to copy that, but failed. They didn't know how to interpret the terrain. The cold slowed them down. They moved slowly. They needed maps, but there weren't any. They relied on local people who also got lost. The Germans divided their patrols. They advanced in small groups. They used flashlights. They avoided open areas. They slept in caves. They sent observers with binoculars. They took photos from above. They made reports. Each step was checked several times. Gudbrandsdal was one of the most tense points. They fought for days. There was shooting between trees, over stone bridges, at empty houses. Casualties were constant. No one gained an advantage. Every step was costly. In Romsdal, the Allies managed to advance for a few days. They climbed, took a hill, cut a crossing, but they couldn't hold. The enemy blocked the route. They left them without resources. They had to abandon. They left everything and walked down. The nights were eternal. The silence was noticeable. Only the ice underfoot could be heard. No one lit a fire. The smoke was visible. They slept in shifts among branches. The ground was stone. They used their backpacks as pillows. Some began to write in notebooks. They recorded steps, shots, the weather. Others drew only lines. They lost track of time. Some tore up their notes before surrendering. When the High Command decided to leave the north, those units were still fighting. No one warned them. They were fighting for places that no longer mattered. No news. Days later, they received the order to regroup. Many didn't reply. Those who came down came with shattered feet, drooping eyesight, their rifles dangling. Some didn't know what day it was. Others didn't speak. They just wanted hot water and a dry place to wait. The mountains were no longer under control. They became crossing zones. No one controlled them. Patrols came and went. The weather didn't improve. But there were no more major clashes, only movement. What happened up there wasn't recorded in books. There were no photos or speeches, just men walking on ice, carrying broken weapons, trying to get back. Norway occupied, but never subdued. Once the main ports were controlled, with the king out of reach and Oslo under military presence, the Germans began to establish their occupation structure. They no longer sought to advance, but to hold what they had. The combat phase gave way to surveillance. Units were positioned in public offices. Train stations became checkpoints. Bridges were reinforced. Post offices were seized. Short-range radios were installed in towns. Routes were patrolled on a fixed schedule, always the same. Each group had its assigned area. In the south, they secured the main lines. In the center, they guarded electrical installations. In the north, they maintained tunnels and depots. Each patrol followed a marked route. The idea was clear: to demonstrate total control. The local reaction was muted. There were no gestures or displays of support. No one saluted the soldiers. Shops were open for only a few hours. Markets bustled by in silence. In cafes, the only sound was the clapping of dishes. Voices faded. From exile, the legitimate government sent messages. They used radio stations in other countries. They announced decisions, called for calm. Within the country, these notes traveled on hidden sheets of paper. They were sewn into clothing, between pages of books, inside packages. The economy was modified. Quotas were set. Transportation was designated for military use. Gasoline was reserved. Coal was distributed with tickets. Bakeries produced less. Butcher shops changed prices frequently. Currency remained in circulation but was subject to intervention. Classes continued, but under a foreign gaze. Textbooks were modified. Maps, photos, and topics were removed. Portraits of the new administrator were posted. Some teachers left, others remained silent. No one stood out. The press operated through a filter. Instructions were given every morning. Anything expressing opinions was eliminated. Only neutral facts were allowed. Letters to the editor were eliminated. Official announcements filled half a page. Radios were searched. Each device had to be on a list. Listening to outside signals was prohibited. Those who did so were arrested. Prizes were offered for reporting. Despite this, many families continued to listen. They turned down the volume. They pressed their ears to the speaker. The arrests weren't massive, but they were punctual. Those who distributed notes, kept weapons, or attended secret meetings were detained. Interrogations took place in basements. Sentences weren't announced. Some names disappeared without explanation. In the midst of this, small networks began to emerge. Groups that didn't use names. They didn't have uniforms. They only shared food, information, routes, codes. Sometimes a glance was enough. Those who led the way were workers, students, farmers, teachers. They dressed like everyone else. They didn't attract attention. Everyone did something: warn, hide, escort, pass objects, all silently. Nothing was recorded. In forested areas, messages were sent in bottles between trees. In tents, coded blackboards were used. In cities, a light from a window served as a warning. No one knew everyone. This was how they avoided falls. The soldiers knew there was movement, but they couldn't track it. They made random searches. They checked houses, books, drawers, shoes. Any gesture aroused suspicion, but no one spoke. During interrogations, everyone repeated the same thing: "I know nothing." The church didn't close. The pastors chose their words carefully. They didn't use names, but every sermon included signs. They spoke of endurance, courage, dignity. The listeners understood. In hospitals, wounded from the resistance were hidden with false information. Dates, diagnoses, and names were changed. The bandages had hidden marks. The staff knew who should remain silent. The trains continued to run, but under surveillance. Some drivers delayed departures so someone could get on or off. Others accelerated to avoid checkpoints. No one asked for it. They did it just because. In factories, the pace slowed. Parts were damaged. Tools were lost. Nothing was explained. Everything happened. There were also those who collaborated. They sought security, rations and positions. They accepted jobs, gave names and kept lists. Everyone knew who they were. No one confronted them, but they were kept to one side. Despite everything, the routine continued. Cooking was done in groups, although with fewer people. Births were celebrated without a party. Weddings were private, with 2 witnesses. Songs were sung without instruments. Dances were held without music. The climate was unfriendly. The winters were harsh. The stoves barely worked. The windows were covered with cardboard. Classes were cancelled due to lack of heat, but life went on. There was little contact with the outside world. Some messages were sent by ship to Sweden. Others were sent by secret radio. Preparing a message could take days. Nothing was certain. News from other countries arrived late, but it arrived. That was enough to keep going. Every Allied advance was celebrated with a lit candle in the kitchen. Officially, Norway was under control. There were foreign flags, guarded offices, signed documents. But in practice, compliance was superficial. Every gesture showed distance. Every street reeked of tension. They never managed to change that underlying sentiment. No parade could mask it. No announcement could correct it. The country remained the same, even if it was covered in uniforms. The invasion of Norway was swift, surprising, and meticulously calculated, but even with all that machinery in motion, it was never a complete triumph. Germany managed to occupy the territory, control ports, and move troops without organized resistance at first, but what seemed like a walk in the park ended in a difficult occupation, with tactical errors, extreme weather, and a population that, while unable to prevent its entry, did not completely surrender either. The country remained under foreign control, yes, but neither the king nor the people nor the terrain made it easy. And what began as a lightning strike ended as an uncomfortable presence, sustained more by force than by acceptance.